I'd already been working at the De Luca mansion when Matteo De Luca caught me dancing alone in the kitchen at midnight. I had no idea he was standing there in the dark, wounded, in absolute silence, watching me like he'd found something too dangerous to want. I was just Nico's nanny, a woman drowning in overdue rent, dwindling medication, and a sick grandmother to save. Staying there seemed simple. Take care of a broken child, and pretend those forbidden doors didn't exist. But Matteo started looking at me like I was the only living light in that house, and when that false sense of safety came to collect its price, running from him might hurt more than staying. Hi, I'm Lena. A special shout-out to those of you watching Book 1 for free here on the My Stories platform, completely ad-free and uninterrupted. Chapter 1. Tea on the Persian Rug. The eviction notice was stuck to the door with yellowing masking tape, and the first thing I thought, before I'd even fully opened my eyes, was that someone had wasted good tape on such a lousy piece of paper. I sat on the edge of the lopsided spring mattress and stared at the slip of cardstock like it might change its mind if I glared at it long enough. It didn't. The numbers were still there, 3 months of back rent, and the landlord's signature slanted down to the right like someone losing patience in the middle of his own handwriting. I picked my phone up off the floor. Margot was calling for the 3rd time, and I knew, before I even answered, that the camera would be out of focus, and she'd pretend it wasn't. I picked up. My grandmother appeared in pieces, half her face in the light, half in the shadow of the yellow lamp on her nightstand, and she smiled in that way that always squeezed me between the ribs. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said. "I took the last blue pill last night." I looked at the ceiling, counted to 3, counted to 5, just to be safe. I smiled back, because smiling is cheaper than crying. "I'll handle it, Grandma. Today. You always handle it." That was the problem. I always handled it, and the always was starting to feel like a place I couldn't keep holding up on my own. I hung up, took a deep breath, pressed my forehead against the cold glass of the window for 2 seconds, and opened my messaging app. Pippa had sent 17 voice notes overnight. The last one said, "Discreet agency, ridiculous salary, live-in nanny, I swear to God, Alara, this is cinematic, and I know you hate movies, but pick up that damn phone." I picked up the phone. The woman on the other end of the line spoke like someone reading aloud from a contract that had already been drafted without me. Confidential address, salary paid on time, absolute confidentiality. An agency car would pick me up at the bus stop in the upscale district. When I asked for the family's name, she only said I'd be told in person, and hung up before I could scrape together enough nerve to push. I put on the best dress I owned, which was also the only one without a stain, and I put on my glasses. The glasses were crooked. They'd been crooked since the day I bought them, and would stay crooked until the day someone with more patience than me decided otherwise. I pushed the frames up the bridge of my nose and looked at the cracked mirror. For 1 second, I looked like a 23-year-old woman who knew what she was doing. It was a good second. It didn't last. The bus took me to where the city changes its smell. In Chicago, the upscale district has a perfume of its own, something between waxed wood and old money, and I stepped off at the right stop with the feeling of someone walking into a party without being invited. The agency's black sedan was already there, parked, the engine too quiet for a car that size. The driver looked me up and down, decided not to say anything, and opened the back door. "Miss Quinn?" "That's me," I answered, and got in without asking anything else, because asking anything else was the kind of thing I'd already trained myself out of. The drive was longer than I expected. The city shrank, the streets widened, and the walls started getting too tall for ordinary houses. The leather seat smelled of something expensive and impersonal, and I pressed my cheek against the glass, just to feel something other than my own pulse. When the car stopped, I looked out the window and almost laughed, because the gate was the size of a promise no one should make. Black iron, a thin spear at the top, a stylized lion against a burgundy background on the side. The kind of gate that doesn't belong to a family, it belongs to a decision. The driver opened the door. I got out clutching my purse against my chest, as if my purse could protect me from something I didn't yet know how to name. The entrance to the mansion was a corridor of pale stone that opened into a double door of dark wood. Before I got close, the door opened on its own, or rather was opened by a woman in a gray uniform with the kind of posture you learn young and never unlearn. She looked at me, measured my crooked glasses with the eyes of someone who measures everything, and said, "Miss Quinn, this way." I walked behind her with my heart in my throat. The foyer had a ceiling so high I couldn't help but look up. A crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling, weighing down the air, and every drop of glass dripped yellow light onto the marble floor. On the floor, dead center in the foyer, was the rug, Persian, deep red, with ivory motifs and gold threads, and the kind of weave that probably predated my whole last name. "You'll wait in the main parlor," the woman said. "I'll bring you tea for your nerves." "My nerves are fine," I lied. She smiled without warmth. She left. She came back seconds later with a white porcelain cup filled to the brim with red tea, and put it in my hands before I could explain that holding liquid in a delicate vessel had never been my strong suit. The cup came without a saucer. The saucer, I understood later, had been left behind on purpose, as a kind of silent test the house was running. I tried to smile. I held the cup with both hands. I felt the heat seep through the porcelain and burn my fingertips. I took 2 steps. On the third, the heel of Pippa's borrowed shoe twisted outward, my knee buckled, and the cup did what every cup does when you're praying it won't. The tea flew. It wasn't a splash. It was a puddle, red as spilled wine, slowly spreading across the exact center of the Persian rug, drawing a new map over a design it had taken centuries to weave. The smell of hibiscus rose, sweet and tart, and reminded me, without warning, of my grandmother's kitchen. I stood still. I looked down. I looked at my shoes. I looked at the rug again, on the absurd hope that it was faking it. "No," I muttered. "No, no, no." I knelt. I pulled the handkerchief from my purse. I started rubbing the puddle with the gentleness of someone who knows rubbing makes it worse. I felt my glasses slip down the tip of my nose, pushed them up with my shoulder, rubbed harder. The stain resisted, the way everything in my life resisted, with the stubbornness of something that knows I don't have enough experience to win. "I hope," I muttered, low, more to myself than to the universe. "I hope this scary man in the expensive suit has a sense of humor. Seriously. I really hope so." A voice came from behind me, deep, calm, so calm it hurt. "I don't." I froze. There's no exact way to describe what happens inside your body when you realize a sentence you said thinking you were alone was heard by the one person who absolutely shouldn't have heard it. It's a kind of shame that starts at the nape of your neck and slides down to your heels under your skin, without asking permission. I closed my eyes. I clenched the soaked handkerchief between my fingers, and I felt a drop of tea trickle down my wrist, cold, drawing a silly line all the way to my elbow. I rose, slowly, paragraph by paragraph of my body, until I was standing. I turned. The man was in the doorway, leaning against the frame just enough to look like he wasn't leaning on anything. Black suit, black shirt, no tie, signet ring on the pinky of his left hand. Dark hair combed back with a discipline that seemed part of his personality. His eyes were the kind that measure a room before deciding whether to step into it. They measured the puddle on the rug. They measured my crooked glasses. They measured me. I cleared my throat. I tried to reconstruct something resembling dignity. Mr. DeLuca, I guessed, because that was the last name embroidered on the crest at the gate, and I'd read it by accident. I can explain. Can you? It was a question without curiosity. It was a question that already knew the answer, and was offering me the polite gift of pretending it didn't. No, actually I can't. I took a breath. I spilled tea on your rug, and called you scary before I knew you were there. That's basically it. Fair summary. He didn't move. He didn't answer. His silence was a material thing. It took up space, and I understood, with strange clarity, that his silence was trained. It was the main tool of this man's trade, the same way the wooden spoon was mine back when I worked at the daycare. "Miss Quinn," he said finally, 23 years old, community daycare contract terminated, 3 months of overdue rent, sick grandmother, mother absent since you were 9. I opened my mouth, closed it, opened it again. You read my file. I read all of it. I pressed the purse against my stomach and heard the old leather creak softly between my fingers. Then you know I need this job. I do. He stepped away from the frame. He walked to the edge of the rug without looking at the stain, as if ignoring the offense were the height of contempt. He stopped 1 step away from me. He was tall. I'd already imagined he'd be tall, but imagining and standing in front of are 2 different things. He smelled of something woody, restrained, expensive in a way that didn't apologize for itself. "You have 1 week. 1 week? To prove you're worth the salary the agency promised. If in 7 days I don't have a reason to keep you, you walk out the same door you walked in. No severance, no letter of reference, no hard feelings. Deal? Deal, I answered, and the word came out before the thought, as always. He nodded once. He looked at last at the rug. That rug is 140 years old. I'm so sorry. I know you are. His eyes came back to mine, and for a second too short to carry weight and too long not to. He looked at me the way you look at a photograph before deciding whether to keep it. Go up. Second door on the right in the east corridor. Bruno will take you. Who's Bruno? The man who's been standing behind you for the past 2 minutes. I spun around. Bruno was in fact there, leaning against the wall of the foyer, arms crossed, with a level of stillness that suggested serious training. He looked at me. He measured my glasses the same way the boss had measured them, but with something lighter at the corners of his mouth, a very small irony, the size of a comma. Ragazza, he said in Italian. Let's go. I looked at Matteo De Luca one last time before following. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking at the Persian rug, hand in his pocket, like someone deciding whether it was worth fixing an old thing or whether it was finally time to retire it. I had the clear impression that decision applied to more than the rug. Bruno took 3 steps. I followed, and my borrowed heels hit the marble with an echo that seemed to give me away every meter. Before we reached the stairs, he spoke for the first time without it being an order. Upstairs, he said, low. There's a boy. Don't push him. Just stay. What do you mean, just stay? Bruno didn't answer. He took the first step. I took the second. Behind me, I knew, without needing to look, that Matteo De Luca was still standing in the foyer and that his silence was following me up the stairs, step by step, like a hand resting at the nape of my neck without touching. At the top of the stairs, the east corridor opened to the right. The air up there was stiller, more closed in, with a faint smell of furniture polish and something I could only name later, much later, as absence. The second door had a fine scratch in the wood, at the height of a child's hand. I stopped in front of it. Bruno stopped beside me and said in exactly 6 words, "He hasn't spoken since the funeral." I swallowed hard. I looked at the scratch. I put my hand on the knob, felt the cold metal under my palm, and for an instant the cold ran up my arm and locked in my chest, and I opened it. Chapter 2. A 1-week trial. The room was too big for a small child. That was the first thing I thought, and the second was that maybe that was exactly the problem. The walls were a dark, smoky blue, the kind that absorbs light instead of giving it back, and the tall window looked out onto the inner garden, the glass so clean it seemed no one dared touch it. The air smelled of waxed wood, and a flower I couldn't name, maybe lavender, maybe not. Maybe just the expensive smell of a house that had staff to choose its scents. In the middle of the room, sitting on the thick rug, was the boy. Nico De Luca was 6 years old. I knew that from the file the agency had given me that morning, but knowing on paper and seeing him on the floor are 2 different things. He was small, dark hair, like his uncle's, huge eyes, the kind of eye that looks like it's inherited more memory than its share. He had a metal toy car in his hand, one of those old collector's models, and he was holding the loose wheel as if it were a piece of his own body that had fallen off without permission. His fingers were closed around the piece with a quiet caution, the kind belonging to someone who learned early that small things get lost, too. Bruno closed the door behind me. He didn't come in. I stood still for a moment, waited for my heart to slow down, and then did the only thing I knew how to do in a child's room when the child didn't know me. I sat on the floor. I didn't speak. I didn't ask permission. I didn't introduce myself in that high, sing-songy voice adults use thinking it helps. I took off my shoes, pushed them aside, folded my legs, and sat on the rug at his level. The rug was soft in an almost indecent way, the kind that sank under your weight and seemed to swallow the sound of your own breathing. My glasses slid down. I pushed them up with my middle finger. The boy looked at me for the first time, took exactly 3 seconds to size me up, and went back to looking at the toy car. "That one," I said, low, more to the air than to him. "Looks like it took a tumble down the stairs." Nico didn't answer. I hadn't expected him to. "Can I see it?" I asked. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no either. He just stretched out his hand, without looking, and placed the car in the space between us on the rug, with a small, exact gentleness, like someone handing over an important thing to someone who didn't yet know it was important. The little wheel came with it, loose, and rolled half a centimeter before stopping. I picked up the car. I examined it. The axle was bent, but not broken, and the metal had that cold weight of things made in another decade, with more care than they're made now. I'd fixed worse on worse kids at the daycare, and the daycare had the budget of a piggy bank. I pulled a bobby pin from behind my ear, bent the tip with my teeth, and started to work. It took a while. It took a while because the axle was thin, because my hand shakes when I'm nervous, and because, in that room, with that boy watching me out of the corner of his eye, there was no way I was handing back a sloppily repaired car. It took me about an hour. At some point, I heard footsteps stopping outside the closed door, a small pause, and then the footsteps moved on down the corridor without anyone coming in. Nico didn't move the whole time. His breathing was steady, regular, and sometimes he leaned forward half a centimeter when the bobby pin slipped, like his body was rooting for the car without his mouth's permission. It was the silence of someone paying attention, not of someone running away. When the wheel snapped back into place, I rolled the car twice across the rug to test it. It ran straight. I smiled. "Done," I said quietly. "Car fixed by a woman with no tools. That should go in some kind of book." I held the car out on my palm. He looked. I waited. I didn't push. After a stretch of time I couldn't measure, he extended 2 thin fingers and took it. His fingers brushed mine for an instant, cool, light, and pulled away too quickly to be called affection. He didn't smile, but he didn't leave either. I counted that as a win. I left the room slowly, without a formal goodbye, because formal goodbyes are only for adults who need ceremony. I closed the door carefully. I turned, and I almost walked face first into Matteo De Luca's chest. He was in the corridor. How long he'd been there I couldn't say. He stood with his arms crossed, leaning against the wall opposite Nico's door, looking at me with the expression of someone cataloging what he saw for some future decision. The black suit, the black shirt, the ring on his pinky, and the eyes. The eyes were the part that hurt, because his eyes didn't wander over your face. They stopped, and stopping is something that costs a lot when it's done by a man like that. "Well," I said, because his silence was a hole, and I'm exactly the kind of person who fills holes with whatever's on hand. "Good first hour, I think. I didn't spill anything in there, so statistically I'm improving." His mouth moved by a millimeter. It wasn't a smile. It was the shadow of one, maybe the skeleton of one, and it was gone before I could be sure I'd seen it. "Miss Quinn," he said finally, "dinner is at 8. You'll come down for dinner." "I'm having dinner with you, sir." "You're having dinner with the house." He pushed off the wall. He walked 3 steps to Nico's door, stopped, and didn't go in. He just laid his hand on the wood, at the height of the fine scratch, and stayed there for a second. His fingers were long, with small calluses where calluses shouldn't exist on a man in a suit that expensive. He didn't look at me. He didn't need to. "The glasses," he said. "What?" "They're crooked." I pushed the frames up with my finger, automatically. "They always are." That was all. He walked down the corridor without making a sound, and the runner muffled his footsteps the way the rest of the house muffled everything. I stood in front of the door for a while, not sure whether to go upstairs, downstairs, back inside, or hand in my resignation preemptively. I went down. Dinner was served in a room that seemed designed by someone who thought of silence as furniture. Long table, dark wood, crystal chandelier above, a folded white silk napkin beside every plate, as if each of us were to the house, a small ceremony. The chandelier light fell in little pieces across the tablecloth, and each crystal glass threw a trembling reflection onto the dark wood, as if the table itself were breathing. I sat where the maid pointed, far from the head. Matteo presided. To his right, an older man, maybe 70, white hair combed to the side and the posture of someone who'd seen too many things to be startled by tonight's dinner. He was the consigliere, later I'd learn the name, Don Tommaso Ricci, the family's advisor, who read a paper newspaper and spoke like a man weighing every vowel before letting it out. There were 3 more men at the table, with that particular way of eating belonging to people who grew up with no one watching. One of them, on the right side of the middle, was thick-necked, easy with a laugh, with small eyes. Don Tommaso called him Greco when he asked for the salt. It was Greco who, after the soup, decided to notice me. "So, the nanny," he said, and the word nanny came out of his mouth with a cartoonish drawl, mocking the way I'd greeted the table. "The nanny came from the suburbs." A short little laugh from himself. No one else laughed. "I did," I answered. "From the suburbs. That's how we talk over there. I already mentioned it on the way in, but you were busy with the soup, sir." The pause that followed was the kind you measure in plates. Fork stopped. Don Tommaso lifted his eyes from his meat, slowly, like a man taking interest in a small thing that had become interesting. Bruno, standing against the wall behind Matteo's chair, twitched a muscle in his cheek that might have been his version of laughing out loud. Matteo didn't look at me. He cut a piece of meat with the precision of a man who'd already decided something he hadn't yet announced. He brought it to his mouth. He chewed. He looked at the heavy-set capo. And he said nothing. His silence, I was starting to understand, had different temperatures. That one was cold. The heavy-set capo got it before I did. He laughed once more, lower, with no humor at all, and went back to his food. He didn't speak to me again. Don Tommaso blinked once, slowly, and returned to his meat. I lowered my eyes to my plate and barely ate, because the stomach, when it clenches, doesn't work in parallel with the mouth. The smell of the wine sauce rose up to my face and hurt in the literal sense of making me ache, because my body remembered I hadn't had a hot meal in 2 days, and my head was telling my body to shut up. When dinner ended, Matteo stood up first. Everyone stood after him, like choreography. I stood too, half a second late. He passed behind my chair on his way to the door, and for an instant his suit brushed the back of the chair, displaced air, a dry scent of wood, and something metallic underneath. He didn't stop. He didn't look at me, but as he passed, he said, low enough that it was only for me, "Tomorrow, 8 in the morning, in the kitchen." What for? For the boy to eat something. And he left. I went up to the room I'd been assigned, at the end of the east corridor, 3 doors past Nico's. The bed was bigger than the bed in my rented room, and the sheets had a clean smell I couldn't remember smelling in a long time. I sat on the edge, took off my shoes, took off my glasses. My feet were trembling a little. I hadn't noticed. I picked up the phone. 11 at night. Pippa was awake, because Pippa was always awake. I called. She answered on the first ring. "Tell me, tell me, tell me," she said, before I'd even cleared my throat. "What's it like in there? Is it fancy? Is it scary? Is it fancy and scary? Because some houses are both, and that's a problem, Alara. That's a symptom." "Pippa, talk." I took a breath. I looked at the ceiling. The ceiling was high. The whole house was high, actually. Too high for a girl who'd been sleeping for 3 months in a room where the ceiling dropped right next to her head when she sat up in bed. "Pippa, I think," I whispered, "I'm working for a Don." Silence on the other end. "For a what?" "A boss. Mafia." "Pippa, he has a signet ring on his pinky and armed men standing against the wall behind him at dinner." "Wait." I waited. I heard on the other end the unmistakable sound of her painted nails tapping on the laptop keyboard. I heard her breath stop and come back. I heard one click, then another, then another. "Pippa?" "Wait." I waited. "Pippa, say something." "Alara," she said, and her voice had moved up a floor. "Alara, the last name. Tell me the last name." "De Luca." Silence. "Pippa, I need to hang up." "What?" "I need to hang up," she repeated, and there was a tremor in her voice I'd never heard before. "I need to hang up and breathe and... This is cinematic, Alara. This is cinematic, and I hate movies. I hate movies. Pippa, for God's sake, tell me what came up on the screen." Another click, another suspended breath on the other end of the line. And then, with nothing more, she hung up. I looked at the phone in my hand. The screen went dark on its own, and the reflection of my own face appeared on it for a second. Pale, glasses out of their usual place, with the face of someone who didn't yet know she had the face of someone afraid. From the window of the room, down in the inner garden, some light came on for 2 seconds and went out, as if someone had opened and shut a door down there in a hurry. I pressed the crooked glasses against my chest, in the dark, without the courage to put them back on my face. Somewhere, inside that too-big house, Nico was sleeping curled around a toy car with a wonky little wheel fixed by a woman who didn't yet know, clearly, what kind of story she'd just stepped into. Chapter 3. Flower at Midnight. Tuesday and Wednesday passed in small silences, Nico pointing at things in the garden without naming them, me pretending not to notice, Bruno crossing the east corridor twice a day without ever looking at me for more than a second. Thursday morning came in through the kitchen window before I did. I was already there, barefoot on the cold floor, with the apron tied crooked and my hair held up by a pencil I'd found on the counter. The sun hit the back of my neck, while I flipped the first pancake of my life that deserved the name, and by the second, I'd already forgotten the burner was on. The smell of burning came up before my reflexes. I yanked the skillet off the burner with too broad a motion, dropped the handle, picked it back up off the floor, lifted it again, and when I turned, Nico was standing in the doorway, watching. The kitchen smelled of toasted butter and something faintly charred, and I thought, with that warm shame that sticks to your chest, That maybe there was a special little hell reserved for people who wasted someone else's flour. He was holding the repaired toy car against his chest like he was carrying a small animal. His huge eyes traveled from the black pancake to my face, and back to the pancake. I tried to smile like someone who hadn't just committed a small culinary crime. "Good morning," I said low. "This is a collector's pancake. There are only 3 in the world. You just met the first one." Nico didn't answer, of course, but he took a step closer, barefoot, his pajama pants dragging on the floor. I grabbed a paper towel from the counter and drew on it a crooked monster with 1 ear and 2 front teeth. I showed him. His small shoulders went up in something that wasn't exactly a smile, but was on its way to becoming one. I served the 3rd pancake, that one, decent, on a little plate, drizzled with some honey from the pantry. I sat on the other side of the table, far enough not to crowd him, close enough to be there. He ate in silence, elbows tucked to his sides, and when he was done, he pushed the empty plate to the middle of the table. It was his way of saying thank you. I understood. In the afternoon, I took a book to the library. It was a room too tall for a 6-year-old boy, with leather-bound spines and a smell of old paper that made me want to apologize for my sneakers. The light came in slats through the shutters, scoring the night blue rug with ruler-straight precision. I sat on the rug, leaning against the couch, and opened a random story. Nico stayed in the corner, far away, pretending to fiddle with something else. I read as if he were glued to me. I changed voices for the dialogue, paused in the funny places, laughed to myself where I needed to. At some point, without my noticing, he'd moved 3 steps closer. That was when I felt, out of the corner of my eye, someone standing in the doorway. Matteo didn't say anything. He didn't come in. He was just there, leaning against the frame, his shoulder against the dark wood and his hands resting on his hips, watching, the black shirt rolled up at the elbows, his face expressionless. I kept reading without looking up, but my voice changed, and I hated noticing that. He stayed too long. When he left, he didn't make a sound. Only the shadow leaking from the doorway onto the rug dissolved. Nico looked at me. I turned the page. "Where were we?" I asked, as if nothing had happened, as if the temperature of the air in the whole room hadn't just changed. The rest of the day went by in small events that don't fit in a diary. Bruno Salvi crossed the east corridor twice and nodded to me both times. The maid taught me where the clean dishcloths were kept. Don Tommaso passed through the parlor with a paper newspaper tucked under his arm and asked me if I'd already learned where the light switches were. I told him I still tripped over 2 of them. He laughed quietly, as if tripping over light switches in other people's houses was the most sensible thing he'd heard all week. At night, after I'd put Nico to bed, Bruno was in the corridor with a glass of water that looked more like decoration than thirst. I was going to walk right past. He spoke, without looking at me. "The girl isn't afraid, Don." It took me half a second to realize he wasn't talking to me. Behind me, coming from the study, Matteo answered with a silence that was its own answer. I sped up and went down the stairs with my cheeks burning, feeling the cold wood under my feet, and the uncomfortable certainty that he could hear me going down. The whole house was asleep when I came back to the kitchen. I'd tried to sleep. I swear I had. The bed was too wide. The sheets smelled of a flower I didn't know the name of, and the silence was so thick I could hear my own heart complaining. When I realized I wasn't going to fall asleep, I went down on the excuse of a glass of warm milk. The kitchen was a deep blue, cut by a yellow light above the stove. The marble of the counter was cold under my palm, and the wall clock read 11:47, with that dry tick that always sounds louder at night. I put the pot on, turned the gas low, and switched on the small radio that lived forgotten on the counter. I found a ridiculous song, the kind they used to play when my mother still lived in our house. I turned it down to the lowest possible volume. I picked up the wooden spoon to stir the milk, and without thinking, I brought the spoon up to my mouth like a microphone. I started dancing alone the way you dance when you think no one's watching. I spun barefoot on the cold floor. I sang without sound. I closed my eyes. For a second, I wasn't the nanny who'd dumped tea on a 140-year-old rug. I was just a 23-year-old girl in a too-big kitchen, dancing to a silly song no one would have picked for her. My foot hit a drop of spilled milk on the tile. I slipped. The spoon flew one way, my hand the other, and the open bag of flour I'd forgotten on the counter came with me. The sound of the bag bursting on the floor was the loudest thing that kitchen had heard in months. A white cloud went up to the ceiling. I dropped, sitting, with the wooden spoon still clenched in my hand, my glasses coated, my hair white, my apron white, my soul white. That was when I heard the laugh. It was low, short, held back like someone laughing against his will. It was the laugh of a man who had forgotten what his own throat sounded like doing that. I froze inside the cloud of flour and looked at the doorway. Mateo was there, standing, leaning against the frame again, but this time with his shoulder shaking faintly, his left hand pressed against his chest over the black shirt. His outline was blurred by the flour on my glasses, but something about the way he was holding his own arm told me he'd come back through a side door. His hair fell a little in his face. His eyes were different, no less dangerous, just disarmed for a second. Upstairs, behind a slightly open door, I heard another small sound. It was a child's laugh, without voice, but it was. Nico had laughed too. I tried to get up with dignity. There was no being dignified covered in flour. I tried to wipe my face with the back of my hand, which only made it worse. The glasses were so coated that I saw Mateo as a shadow inside fog. He came into the kitchen in 3 slow steps. He didn't look at the mess. He looked at me. He stopped in front of me, too tall, and lifted his right hand. I held my breath, because I thought he was going to pull me out of there. Instead, his thumb landed on the lens of my glasses. Slowly, with a firmness that didn't match the gesture, he ran his finger over the left one, wiped the white away, then ran it over the right. I didn't breathe. His breath was too close, smelling of expensive whiskey and night, with that metallic residue that only the cold outside leaves on a man's clothes. His skin was warm. Mine was on fire. When he finished, I saw his face clearly for the first time that night. His dark eyes traveled down from my nose to my mouth and back, and for a second, I swore he was going to say something that would change the size of the world. He didn't. He took a step back. He looked at the blood on his own sleeve, like someone only just remembering it was there. He looked at the burst bag of flour. He looked at me again, longer than he should have, and went to the sink. He turned on the tap. He washed his hands with the calm of a man not in a hurry for anything, and the water ran pink for an instant before going clear again. He dried them on the towel hanging there. He walked back toward me, and for a moment I thought he was going to do something absurd, like help me up. He just took the wooden spoon out of my hand. He laid it on the drying rack carefully, as if it were fine china. Then he crossed the kitchen back the way he'd come, stopped in the doorway, and looked back over his shoulder. "Don't slip again," he said low. "I'm not on infirmary duty." He left without waiting for an answer. His footsteps went up the stairs at a pace that wasn't hurried, but wasn't what it had been before either. Upstairs, Nico's half-open door eased shut slowly, like someone who didn't want to get caught. I stayed sitting on the floor, in the middle of the flour, with my breath caught between my teeth. I looked at the wooden spoon on the drying rack. I looked at the small red mark his thumb had left on my glasses when he ran his hand over them. It was his blood. It had come from his sleeve. I wiped it off with the hem of the apron. My hands shook more than I wanted to admit, and for a long moment, I just stayed there, listening to the forgotten milk start to rise in the pot and the tick of the clock take its place back in the kitchen, as if nothing had happened. I woke up late. I walked into the kitchen with the face of someone about to apologize to a cleaning lady. There was no flour anywhere. The floor had been mopped. The counter was gleaming. The burst bag had vanished, as if I'd dreamed the whole night. On top of the counter, in a place where it was impossible not to see, there was a new cup, blue, smooth, with a white interior. Next to it, a small card, folded in half, in the firm handwriting of a man who doesn't repeat an order, for future food inspections. I read it 3 times. I ran my finger along the rim of the cup, feeling the porcelain cold, too smooth, bought with the kind of care no one fakes. I looked around, like he might appear in one of the doorways and take it back. He didn't appear. Bruno passed through the corridor with his decorative glass of water and pretended not to see me pick up the card. The maid murmured good morning. The house worked the way it always did. I squeezed the card between my fingers, picked up the cup, and went to put the kettle on the burner. As I turned the gas, I realized I was smiling to myself like an idiot. That was when the phone rang in the pocket of my apron. It was Pippa. I answered with a joy too big for my chest. "Pippa, hi, Ilara." Her voice cut in. She was breathless. "Ilara, listen. I looked into it. I looked into everything. Every article, every photo, every name. Pippa, calm down. Ilara, this man..." She took a deep breath. "This man owns half of Chicago, and not the good half." The kettle started whistling behind me. I didn't move. The folded card was still in my hand, and for a moment, I read for future food inspections again, with a different weight, as if the ink had changed color between one reading and the next. "Ilara, you need to get out of there," Pippa said quietly. "You need to get out of there today." The kettle screamed. The card was heavy, and somewhere on the upper floor, I swear, I heard a door close with the care of someone who didn't want to be caught listening. Chapter 4. She Stayed. I didn't leave that day, or the next. I told Pippa I needed to think, and hung up before she could argue. I put the new cup in the cupboard, on the highest shelf, like someone hiding a secret from her own eyes. When I woke up on Saturday, my glasses were on the nightstand, repaired, the arms aligned for the first time in 3 years. New screws, the right lens without the old scratch I'd already learned to ignore. I turned the thing over between my fingers, not understanding. No one came into my room without knocking. I thought of him before I thought of anyone else, and I thought of him without his name coming with it. Only the shape of his silence crossing through the door in the dead of night. I put the glasses on. The world snapped into the sharpness of an expensive film. I went down to the kitchen with my head low, ashamed of something I didn't yet know how to name. The study door was ajar when I passed the corridor on my way to the kitchen. Greco was standing in front of the desk, the same hair combed back from dinner, the same signet ring on his pinky, but without the face of a man who found anything funny now. Don Tommaso was sitting, with the paper newspaper folded over his knee, and his voice came low enough that I had to stop before the doorway to make it out. "You've been demoted, Greco," Tommaso said. "As of today, you no longer run the port territory." The capo opened his mouth and shut it. "Why?" he asked, and his voice came hoarse. "For laughing at that young lady's accent on the stairs." Tommaso turned a page of the newspaper. "The Don doesn't like noise in his own house." I froze behind the doorway. The kettle I'd come to fetch stayed forgotten on the stove. Greco glanced at the stairs by reflex, and I swear I took 2 steps back, into the dark of the corridor, before he could see me, heart in my mouth. I gathered the hem of my apron in both hands, and went to the other side of the house before I forced myself to breathe. The repaired glasses weighed on the bridge of my nose like an announcement. I spent the morning with Nico in the inner garden. It was a place too big for a boy, with tall rose bushes that made walls, and a basil bed that smelled of summer. Nico had brought a box of chalk and a notebook. I sat on the warm stone and pretended to read while he drew crooked houses on paper. Every now and then he lifted his pencil and looked at me like someone checking whether I was still there. "Still," I murmured to myself, without him hearing, and turned the page of a book I wasn't reading. That was when I heard it. It was a branch. It was a branch in the wrong way, at the wrong height, on the wrong side of the garden. There was no wind. There was no dog. Nico was still drawing, with red chalk on his left cheek. I lifted my head slowly and looked to the right, between the rose bushes, and saw, through the leaves, a shadow that didn't belong there. It was a man. I saw the shoulder. I saw the hand holding something that glinted faintly in the sun. I saw the posture of someone who knows how to move without being seen, and who, in that moment, had been seen. My body moved before my mind. I shut the book, took Nico by the elbow, and lifted the boy off the ground in one motion. "We're going inside," I said, low, with the steadiest voice I'd ever managed. "Without running. Come on." I crossed the glassed-in corridor holding Nico against my hip, his chin on my shoulder. My sneakers hit the tile in a rhythm I tried to control so it wouldn't sound like panic. The greenhouse was at the end of the corridor, behind a glass door that creaked. I pushed. I went in. The warm, humid air wrapped around us like a wrong kind of hug. Behind a clay pot the size of a man, I put Nico on the floor. I crouched down to his height. His eyes were huge lakes. "You stay here," I said, holding his small face between my hands. "No matter what you hear, you stay here." "Deal." He didn't answer, but he nodded once, slowly, and it was the most solid yes I'd ever received in my life. I grabbed the garden shears that were on the counter. It wasn't a weapon. It was a pair of shears, but the blade weighed in my hand like it was worth something, and I planted myself in front of the greenhouse door with my feet apart on the stone floor, holding the shears with both hands at chest height. I heard footsteps in the glassed-in corridor, more than one pair. They came slowly, like people who weren't in a hurry because they didn't think anyone was waiting. My knees shook a tremor I couldn't control, but I didn't move. "Not Nico," I whispered to myself without realizing. "Not Nico, not Nico, not Nico." The footsteps stopped behind the glass. I saw a figure lean forward to look. That was when I heard the gunshots. They were short, contained. 3 of them, then 2 more, and they came from another corridor, from a point beyond my line of sight. The figure behind the glass turned its head the other way, hesitated a second, and ran. Another shot. A short voice I didn't catch. A body falling somewhere in the garden. Then silence. a thick, dense silence that entered the greenhouse like mist. I didn't lower the shears. The glass door burst open in one motion. Bruno came in first, pistol raised, his eyes sweeping every pot. Behind him, Matteo, no jacket, the black shirt with the top button open, his hair wet with sweat at the temples, a gun in his right hand that he lowered the second he saw me. He crossed the greenhouse in 4 steps. He stopped in front of me. He looked at the shears in my hand, the way you look at a child holding a kitchen knife. He looked at me. His breathing was heavy, and I saw for the first time his chest rise and fall too fast. "Where is he?" Matteo asked. The voice came hoarse. It wasn't the Don's voice. It was an uncle's. I couldn't answer. I pointed with my chin to behind the clay pot. Matteo went past me without touching me, knelt on the stone floor on one knee and held out his arms. Nico came out from behind the pot slowly, with the red chalk still on his cheek. He took small steps over to his uncle without looking at anything else, and pressed himself into the embrace with his face buried in the black shirt. Matteo closed his eyes. I saw his jaw lock hard. I saw his hand go up and down on his nephew's small back. I saw his shoulder tremble once, just once, before going back to the stone he always was. Then he raised his eyes. To me. "You leave here today," he said. I gripped the shears tighter. The tears beat me to my voice. "No," I said. "Today, Alara. No. You almost died." His voice rose for the first time in 3 days. "You're not trained for this. You shouldn't be here. You should never have come into this house." "But I did," I said, and the tears dripped from my chin to the apron. "And he gave me the toy car, and I stayed. And you're not going to send me away just because you're scared." "I'm not." "Yes, you are," I cut in. My voice was shaking, but it was coming out. "You're terrified. I saw your face when you came in here. You thought you were going to find me dead on the floor, and now you want to send me away so you don't have to feel that again. I get it, but Nico doesn't need a safe house that feels like a tomb." The whole greenhouse went still. Bruno turned his face a little toward the window. Matteo looked at me as if I'd spoken in a language he understood, but had forgotten. And that was when it came. It came from the boy's chest. It came muffled against his uncle's shirt, hoarse, low, with the fragility of a door that had forgotten how to be opened. It came in 2 words only. "She stayed." Matteo froze. Bruno did too. So did I. So did the whole world. Nico lifted his head off his uncle's chest, with the red chalk still on his cheek, and repeated it looking right at me, with those huge eyes that had learned to speak before his mouth did. "She stayed." Matteo lowered his second knee to the stone floor. He held his nephew with both hands open against the small back, pressed his forehead into his hair, and breathed in a way I'd never heard a man breathe. He didn't cry, but he couldn't speak for a stretch of time that felt longer than it was. I stayed standing. I held the door handle of the greenhouse behind me with my free hand, because I wasn't sure my legs would hold the rest. The shears fell to the stone floor with a metallic clatter, and I didn't even remember to pick them up. When Matteo lifted his head, he didn't look at me. He looked at his nephew. He said low, "Go with Bruno to your room. I'll come up." Nico nodded once, let go of his uncle with an adult's calm, and went over to Bruno without looking back. Bruno put his large hand on the boy's small shoulder, and the 2 of them left the greenhouse in silence. The glass door closed. Matteo stayed kneeling on the stone floor a few more seconds. Then he stood. He came over to me. He stopped 1 step away, too close for etiquette, too far for anything else, and I saw up close for the first time a smear of blood on his sleeve. It wasn't his. The shirt was intact. He lifted his right hand slowly, like someone asking permission without a word, and took my glasses off my face. He wiped the left lens with the hem of his own shirt. Then the right. Without hurry, without saying anything, he put the glasses back on my face with both index fingers, adjusting the arms behind my ears with a delicacy that was almost an offense, given the hour. When the glasses came back to me, I saw his face in focus, the locked jaw, a small cut at the corner of his eyebrow I hadn't even noticed, the bottomless black eyes. "You stay," he said. It wasn't a question. I swallowed hard. The tears had stopped. "I stay." He nodded once. He walked out of the greenhouse with the step of a man who still had a house to put in order, a garden to clean up, a rival family to look in the eye. I stayed alone among the pots with the shears on the floor, and my breathing in pieces, and there, leaning against the glass door, I let my body slide down to the floor and cried the way I hadn't allowed myself to cry my whole life. Nobody slept that night. The whole house was awake, on its feet, in motion. I stayed with Nico in his room until he passed out, sitting in the armchair next to the bed, his hand holding 2 of my fingers. When his breathing turned to sleep, I went to my room without letting go of those fingers on the inside. I had my pajamas on when there was a knock at the door. 2 knocks. Short. I knew, before opening, who it was. I opened a crack. Mateo was there, in a changed shirt, hair damp from a quick shower, eyes tired in a way I'd never seen. He didn't come in. He stood in the doorway. "I just came to check," he said low. "Whether you're breathing." I blinked. I didn't know what to say. He waited half a second, watched my chest rise and fall once, and nodded like someone checking off a delivery. "Good night," he said. He turned. He took 3 steps down the corridor. I stayed with the door open a crack between my fingers, and before he turned the corner toward his own room, before I could close the gap, before I could pretend to myself that this was professionalism, I heard him stop. The footsteps stopped. They didn't come back. They didn't go on. They just stopped, and I understood, with a clarity that hurt my chest, that he was waiting to hear my door close first. Chapter 5. The House That Wasn't a Tomb. Sunday morning came into the room at the mansion like something cautious, not touching the bed. I woke up before the alarm, before the house, before Nico, and for a few seconds I didn't know where I was. Then I remembered the corridor, Mateo's breathing on the other side of the door, the doorknob I'd held until my fingers went white. I remembered the weight of the shears in my hand in the greenhouse, the warm smell of wet earth and crushed leaves. I remembered the small voice saying she stayed, and my stomach clenched like it might happen again at any moment. I put on the repaired glasses. It was a strange feeling to see the ceiling of the mansion so clearly. Every molding, every grain of the wood, every shadow the still cool light drew on the stucco. Mateo De Luca's world had too much texture when I could see it properly. Even the smell of the sheets seemed different. Discreet lavender, expensive soap, the kind of clean that hadn't existed in my life before. I went down without making a sound. The handrail was cold under my palm, and my bare feet found a runner that muffled everything, even thought. Bruno was in the foyer, in his usual dark suit, and with the face of a man who had never needed sleep. "Don's orders." "I'm taking you to Margot," he said. 6 words. Exact. "Car's at the door." I didn't ask. "I know, ragazza." He didn't look at me while he said it. I grabbed the coat folded on a bench. It was mine, but someone had run an iron over it, and it still held the warm heat of someone who had taken care of it not long before. The armored car crossed the upscale district and made its way down to the suburbs slowly, as if it recognized the smell of the wrong neighborhood and wanted to apologize. I rode with my forehead against the window. The glass was cold, and my breath drew a round smudge that vanished on its own. I thought about the days going by like a fast-forwarded film. Tea on the Persian rug, Nico's room, the burned pancake, the flour, the greenhouse, the shears. She stayed, and I could no longer imagine what it had felt like to wake up without hearing Bruno trading 6-word sentences with the silence. When we got to Margot's door, the box of medication was on the step. White box, sealed, with her name on a printed label, no markings, no card, no sender. I looked at Bruno. Bruno looked at the dashboard. "I didn't see anything, miss." Margot opened the door in her bathrobe, her white hair tousled in a way that always squeezed my chest. She looked at me. She looked at the black sedan parked in front of the building. She looked at Bruno leaning against the side of the car, pretending to check his watch. She didn't ask anything. She pulled me inside by the elbow, with the tiny, stubborn strength she still had left. The house smelled of chamomile tea and old medicine. I set the new box on the table, on top of the threadbare crocheted runner she refused to replace. Margot sat in her usual armchair and watched me take off my coat with that way of hers, of reading what I wasn't saying. "Are you eating, girl?" "I am." "Are you sleeping?" "I'm trying." She nodded toward the window with her chin. Bruno was still out there, standing like a statue who knew the name of every street in the neighborhood. "That man isn't simple, Alara." "I know." "No, you think you know." She placed her hand on mine, and her hand trembled more than the last time, with that fine tremor I pretended not to see. "Some men are difficult because they're shallow. That one is difficult because he's deep. Be careful." I didn't know how to answer. I kissed her hair, checked the doses of her pills, counted the month's supply for the 3rd time, pretended my eyes weren't filling. Margot let me pretend. She'd always been good at that. When I left, Bruno opened the car door without comment. He glanced up at the 2nd-floor window, where Margot was watching us from behind the curtain, the faded blue robe against the glass. He tilted his head half a centimeter, a small bow I never would have noticed if I hadn't been wearing the repaired glasses. The mansion was in a different silence when I got back. It wasn't the silence of arrival, heavy with ceremony. It was a silence that seemed to be waiting for someone to breathe first. Even the pendulum clock in the parlor seemed to tick more softly, as if it respected the hour. Bruno closed the front door behind me and just said, "Study, when you're ready." I went up to my room first. I took off the coat. I looked in the mirror. A girl in glasses that were too straight. A wrinkled dress. Hair pinned up any old way. I couldn't recognize the embarrassed Nanny who'd spilled tea on a Persian rug 7 days earlier. I didn't know yet whether this new one was better. I only knew she was another. I went down. The study door was ajar. Matteo was standing at the window, his back to me, sleeves rolled to the elbows. The white bandage on his left arm glowed in the weak afternoon light, and against the heavy curtain he looked cut out in ink. He didn't turn around right away when I came in. He waited until I'd closed the door behind me, and then, slowly, he turned. "Sit. I'd rather stand." He accepted that. He sat down himself, at the corner of the desk, without taking the Don's chair. A small gesture, but I saw it. "My sister's name was Serafina," he began, and his voice was a note lower than usual, as if every syllable had to pass through a sieve before coming out. "The Sorrento killed her 1.5 years ago. I'm not going to tell you the details. Not because you can't take it, because I can't say it out loud without it becoming something else." I didn't interrupt. I sat on the arm of the chair, against my own will. The leather creaked under my weight, too loud for the silence of the study. Nico was in the second car with the nanny. He saw. He hasn't spoken since that night until yesterday. I closed my eyes for half a second. Behind my eyelids, the greenhouse again, the shears, the small voice. "I brought you into this house because an agency assured me you were good. I didn't bring you expecting you to stay. I didn't bring you expecting Nico to speak again. I didn't bring you expecting—" He stopped, weighed the sentence, picked another, expecting anything, really. "And now? Now I know you're in danger by being here." He clasped his hands over his knee. The signet ring on his pinky glinted, a thread of matte gold against tanned skin. "I'll pay a full year's rent for you. I'll keep paying for your grandmother's medication. No conditions. You can take the car in an hour and never hear about this house again. No one will come looking for you. I guarantee it." Who guarantees a Don's guarantee? It was the first time I saw him almost smile that afternoon. Almost. One corner of his mouth went up 0.5 millimeter and went back down before I could be sure. Me. Personally. "And if I don't want to leave?" He looked at me for too long. I held the look without looking away, and it was harder than holding the shears at the greenhouse door. The air between us got dense in a way I didn't know how to name. It wasn't fear. It wasn't exactly desire. It was the sum of the two pressing on my chest at the same time. "Then it's your choice, and I'll respect it. But you need to decide knowing everything, not deciding in the dark." I thought about the word dark. I thought of it coming back later. Years later, maybe. I didn't know why. "I need a day," I said. "Take as long as you want." "A day is enough." He nodded. He stood. He didn't walk me to the door. When I already had my hand on the knob, I heard his voice behind me, low. "Ilara." I turned. "Thank you for standing at the greenhouse door." I couldn't answer. I closed the door carefully so his voice wouldn't slip out with me. "Sopra." I spent the afternoon with Nico in the garden. The rose bushes were quiet, with buds closed like small red fists. Bruno's men walked the perimeter at an elegant distance, pretending not to be there, and the gravel crunched softly under their heavy soles. Nico didn't speak again. The voice he'd spent in the greenhouse seemed to need rest, but he took my hand when we passed the stretch of the flower bed, where the figure had appeared. He squeezed my fingers. I squeezed back. I didn't need any more words than that. We came back through the kitchen. The afternoon sun came in, cut by the tall windows, leaving warm stripes on the marble floor. I made hot chocolate, without burning it this time, and Nico drew a monster on the napkin, a black lion with crooked little eyes. I recognized the DeLuca crest, without him knowing he was drawing the crest. I tucked the napkin into the pocket of my dress, folded in 4. Before dinner, I passed by the study corridor because of a book I'd forgotten in the library, and the door was ajar again. The voices inside were restrained, but not low enough for the empty corridor. "You need to send that girl away, Matteo." It was Don Tommaso, the consigliere, the rustle of newspaper between the words. "For her sake. The decision is hers, Tommaso. You're the Don. The decision could be yours. It always has been. Not this one. The Sorrento know now that she matters. You understand what that means." "I understand." "Then send her away." "I won't." There was a long pause, the kind Don Tommaso used to fold the newspaper without creasing it. I almost heard the discreet rasp of the paper yielding between his fingers. You've never been one to hesitate, Matteo. I'm not hesitating. I'm waiting. Waiting for what? For her to choose. I held my breath in the corridor. The floorboards didn't creak. They never creaked in the east corridor. I'd already learned. I crept away on tiptoe, without the book, with my heart in my ear, and the echo of that last word of his still caught between my ribs. I went up to the room. I sat on the edge of the bed. I took off the repaired glasses, placed them on the nightstand, in the same spot where they had appeared that morning without warning. Without them, the world went back to being a blurred watercolor, and for a moment, it was a relief not to see so clearly. I thought about all the things I should have been thinking about. The danger, the gulf between our worlds, my grandmother, the rent, the fear, my better judgment. I really thought. And then I realized I'd already thought about all of that the whole week, in layers, without noticing, while I fixed a toy car with a bobby pin, while I danced with a wooden spoon, while I planted myself in a doorway with a pair of shears in my hand. I'd already chosen in each of those gestures, without signing the contract out loud. The house below breathed slowly. Nico slept in the next room, with the breathing of a child who feels safe. Bruno checked doors, one lock click at a time, at regular intervals like a metronome. Matteo would still be in the study, pretending to work, with the white bandage glowing under the green desk lamp. I lay down on my back, looking at the ceiling that I could now see too clearly, and whispered into the dark, more to the ceiling than to myself. All right then. I woke up with the light from the garden coming through the curtain, and the strange feeling that something had moved out of place inside me during the night. The air in the room was warm, with that soft smell of a morning still intact. I looked at the nightstand. The repaired glasses were where I'd left them. But, next to them, there was a small folded piece of paper, the kind Matteo used for notes in the study. I hadn't heard the door open. I unfolded it. The paper was thick, creamy, with a discreet watermark in the corner. 4 words, in his fine, slanted handwriting. I've already chosen 2. Chapter 6. Midnight. No music. The following weeks learned to pass at a rhythm I didn't know. Nico went back to speaking in short sentences, then in longer sentences, then in questions no one knew how to answer. Why the sky was blue at the top and orange at the bottom. Why his uncle slept with the door unlocked. Why the kitchen always smelled of rosemary even when no one had been cooking. Bruno stopped calling me Miss, and started calling me Ragazza, without noticing he'd changed, and when he noticed, he pretended he'd always called me that. Don Tommaso started leaving the newspaper open to the crossword puzzle every time I crossed the library, never admitting it was for me. I would fill in 2, 3 clues, leave the pencil on top of the paper, and move on. The next day, the newspaper would come back with my letters circled in red pen, right or wrong. No comment. The house didn't turn light. It wasn't that kind of house. But it breathed in a way that felt less like a tomb. Matteo watched me from across the room. Up close, in passing. He never touched me. He never said anything that sounded like a decision. He was just there, leaning in the doorway, at the corner of the dinner table, behind me in the corridor without my having heard him arrive. He was at the threshold of the library when I read to Nico, without coming in, without leaving. He was at the corner of the couch when I dozed off with the boy in my lap, without sitting down, without standing up. And I, who had been convincing myself for weeks that I was invisible to a man like that, was learning to know the exact distance at which he stopped breathing when I walked into the same room. It was a distance of 3 steps. I counted more than once. It happened again on a Wednesday. Midnight. Kitchen. I went down because I wasn't sleeping, and going down was better than listening to the silence of the room. The corridor was dark, with that satin half-light old houses have, and my bare feet found every floorboard that creaked. I put milk in a pot, not to drink, to have something to do with my hands. The window above the sink was cracked open, and the cold Chicago air slid down to my feet, with that smell of wet autumn that came in through the gaps in houses every year, without asking permission. I was in my old pajama shirt, the same one as always, too big across the shoulders, with a small hole in the hem I had never mended. There was no music. There was no wooden spoon this time. There was only the sound of the pot heating, the soft tick of the milk starting to stir at the bottom of the aluminum, and my own breathing, which was louder than I wanted it to be. Outside, somewhere in the garden, one of the security lights blinked and came back on. I pretended I hadn't seen it. He appeared in the kitchen doorway. He didn't lean against the frame. He didn't stand watching from the corridor. He came in, his feet bare too, made almost no sound on the wood floor, only a tiny vibration that I felt before I heard. "Still afraid?" he asked low. I didn't turn around right away. I pretended to stir the milk with the spoon, as if it needed stirring. The spoon turned twice in the warm liquid. "Of the house, no." "Of what then?" I didn't answer. He didn't press. He walked to the counter. He stopped close to me, but not touching. The space between his shoulder and mine was half a step, the kind of distance he decided on, and that I decided on too, without either of us explaining. I felt the heat of his arm near mine without contact. It was worse than contact. "Turn off the burner, Ilara." I turned it off. The click of the knob sounded too loud in the quiet kitchen. He held out his hand. His hand was large, and had the signet ring on the pinky, cold under the yellow light of the hood, and a fine scar near the thumb I had never seen this close. A white line, old, the kind that doesn't tell its own story. I looked at the hand. I looked at his face. I looked at the hand again. I put mine on top. His skin was warm. Mine was trembling a little, and he noticed, and pretended not to. He pulled me, slowly, without force, into the middle of the space between the counter and the window. There was no music. I thought for the first time in my life that dancing didn't need music. It needed only two people who had decided the same thing in separate silences, in separate rooms, in separate weeks. I rested my forehead against his chest. He smelled of soap and the small hours of morning, with that discreet undercurrent of something woody I had never been able to name. His shirt was clean this time. No cut, no blood, nothing that was the dawn. Just soft cotton against my cheek, and his heart beating on the other side, faster than he wanted me to know. His hand went down to my waist and stopped there, firm, not asking for more. The other hand held mine and kept it pressed against his chest, caught between the two beats. We moved slowly between the counter and the window, half a step one way, half a step the other. The cold tile of the floor reminded me, with every movement, that this was real. His mouth touched my temple, and I felt his breath stumble for the first time. I had seen Matteo De Luca cross a room full of armed men without losing the rhythm of his own chest. That night, dancing with me without music, he breathed wrong and didn't try to hide it. "Stay," he said against my hair. I already stayed. He pulled back half a centimeter, just to look at me. His eyes were darker than I remembered, darker than the corridor behind him. He took the glasses off my face with 2 fingers, slowly, like disarming something fragile, and set them on the counter behind me. The world turned into a golden blur of hoodlight and open window. I didn't need to see to know where he was looking. He kissed me. It wasn't a hurried kiss. It was the opposite of that. It was the kiss of a man who had waited weeks to learn how to bring his mouth close to mine without deciding for me. Slow, drawn out, with no hurry at all, as if the kitchen would last for the rest of our lives, and our lives would last the rest of the kitchen. His hand went up to the back of my neck, held my hair at the roots, and even so kept going slowly. I grabbed the front of his shirt with both fists, and didn't let go. I felt the fabric wrinkle between my fingers. I felt his chest rise and fall against mine. I felt that I wasn't deciding anything anymore, and was deciding everything at once. When he pulled his mouth away from mine, I still had my eyes closed. I felt his forehead touch mine. "Come." It wasn't an order. It was a question phrased as a statement. I took the glasses off the counter. I put them on crooked, like always. We went up the stairs together. His hand held my wrist, his thumb moving slowly across the bone, in a minimal motion that seemed to want to anchor me at every step. Nico was sleeping at the end of the corridor. I glanced at his door as I passed, out of habit, and Matteo waited for me to look before moving on. I liked that. I liked it more than I wanted to like it. The door to his room closed behind us without a sound. Morning came in through the window without asking permission. Weak sun, the Chicago kind, that doesn't warm you, just announces itself. It hit the wood floor at an angle, and brought out a fine layer of dust I hadn't noticed the night before. I woke up with my face against his shoulder, and it took me a few seconds to understand why the ceiling was at the wrong angle, why the sheet smelled of a different soap, why the silence was unlike any silence I knew in that house. Matteo was already awake. He was looking at the ceiling too, one hand behind his head, the other on my waist, with the thumb resting on my skin in a way that looked forgotten and wasn't. The scar on his forearm was now a thin pink line, the kind that turns into memory instead of wound. When he noticed I'd opened my eyes, he turned his face slowly. Morning. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The hand on my waist squeezed lightly, and that said the rest. The kitchen, half an hour later, was different. The sun was coming in whole now, hitting the marble counter, and making the sugar jar look like an object from a magazine. There was burnt toast. Mateo had decided to make coffee, and the coffee had decided to protest, and the toaster had decided to back the coffee up. A thin smell of singed bread hovered over everything. I came down in his pajama shirt, which was too big at the shoulders, and came down to mid-thigh, with his smell still in the fabric. The glasses were crooked again. They were always crooked. Nico was sitting on the counter with his legs swinging, in striped socks and faded blue pajamas. He looked at me. He looked at Mateo. He looked at the coffee that was too black even by his standard, which was already low. "Did you sleep in Uncle's room?" he asked without ceremony. I choked on air. Mateo, on the other side of the kitchen, with a cup in his hand, and his shoulders relaxed in a way I had never seen, didn't choke on anything. He just said, "She did." Nico nodded, like someone ticking off an item on an internal list, and stole a piece of toast from Mateo's plate. Then he stole one from mine. He chewed both at the same time, with his cheeks full, and went back to swinging his legs as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened in that house over the past 8 hours. Bruno appeared in the doorway with a folder under his arm. He took in the scene in 1 second. He stepped back 3 paces, pretended he had never arrived, and the sound of the side door closing very slowly was the most discreet thing that House had heard in weeks. I was certain he had seen everything, including the part he hadn't seen. Don Tommaso passed by the kitchen doorway later, with the newspaper under his arm, and didn't even come in. He just tilted his head 1/2 centimeter in my direction, from the corridor, and continued toward the library as if that tilt hadn't happened. I caught the gesture. I kept it. Mateo ran his thumb across the back of my hand under the table while Nico told us, with his mouth full, a story about a crooked monster that had appeared in his drawing again, this time with 3 eyes and a flip-flop. His thumb moved from one side of my bone to the other, slowly, as if that movement were the most important thing he had to do that morning. And maybe it was. I looked out the kitchen window. The inner garden gleamed in the late morning light. The rose bushes were quiet, with dew that hadn't yet dried at the tips. Bruno's men walked the perimeter at an elegant distance, as always, in dark suits that didn't match the bright morning. Everything seemed to be exactly in its place. For 1/2 second, I thought his world still had paths I didn't know. I picked up another piece of toast. It was burnt, too. Mateo glanced at me from the side, noticing the silence 1/2 centimeter longer than it should have been. "You okay?" I smiled. The sun was pretty in the kitchen. Nico was stealing his 3rd piece of toast. Bruno was pretending the coffee wasn't undrinkable, and that the morning was any other morning. The house breathed. All good. Lena here. That wraps up Book 1, and I've already finished Book 2. You can get access to it for a really small fee. I almost believed Matteo De Luca was the safe place life had never given me. 3 months after the night he saw me dancing alone, I was already sleeping in his shirt, breathing in his scent, and I even believed that mansion was my home, until the headline went off like a bomb in the middle of my illusion. Mob boss keeps a secret mistress while seducing his nephew's nanny. In the photos, a woman was wearing the shirt I knew so well, the same one I put on every night. In the envelope they left at my door, the note finished me off. "You were dancing while he was sleeping in another woman's arms." When I confronted Mateo, he didn't deny it. He didn't apologize. He didn't say a word. He just looked at me in silence. That cold, calculated silence. The silence of a man who already knew he'd be found out, and kept lying anyway. Then he gave me that look of superiority that made it perfectly clear this was his world, and I was supposed to accept it. And it was in that brutal silence between the two of us that I understood, with my chest bleeding. The betrayal wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of the humiliation he had been planning for me from the very first look, and I fell for it like a fool. Like I said, that was just a taste of Book 2. To watch it uncensored, just click on the first link here in the pinned comment. I'll see you on the other side in a few seconds. Remember, just click on the first link down here in the comments, and Book 2 complete, no ads, no interruptions, will already be available for you. It's very simple. Book 2 is something I'm loving making. You're loving it too, so I promise there will be more. It's where you find increasingly spicy stories, a true dark romance. And precisely because this version is getting more and more heated, the video isn't well accepted publicly on YouTube. This closed environment is where I can actually share my essence and where I feel free to do my best work for you. More news coming soon. I'll be waiting for you on the other side. Congratulations! Your purchase has been confirmed, and you now have full access to books 1 and 2 of all our stories, completely ad-free and uninterrupted. Everything is available on the My Stories platform, from Mafia romance and billionaire romance to our spicier tales. This content is ready for you now, with new episodes added daily. Access is simple. Just log in using the same email address you used for your purchase. A confirmation has also been sent to that same email. The My Stories platform is very simple and intuitive. Each image represents a story. If it has a book too, just click and press play. Everything is already unlocked for you. You can also rate each story, leave a like, and write a comment. Your feedback will be visible to all our other subscribers. This is our romance universe, so please feel free to interact. From this moment on, this is officially your home for romance stories. Just head over to mystoriesromance.com and press play. Welcome to the family.